We're going to look at some additional UI components that we can incorporate in building our applications, additional ways that we can allow the user to interact with our app, as well as provide feedback to them. So, historically, in building applications, we've focused on placing views inside layouts, and that forms the UI for our activities. There are other mechanisms, however, that exist in the Android SDK that we can use to accomplish both user interaction and feedback. These components tend to be built on the same view and layout building blocks. However, these are generally pre-made and we just need to incorporate them into our application flow. So let's look at some examples. We've seen the app bar since the beginning. Generally, it's the bar that runs across the top of an activity that, at the very least, serves to identify the activity to the user. In addition to this feature, however, the app bar is able to provide additional functionality. For instance, it is able to provide actions by incorporating menu items, and it can also provide some rudimentary navigation, usually giving the user the ability to go back to the previous page in a hierarchy. A floating action button, sometimes referred to as a FAB, is a button that sits slightly above the activity on the Z axis. So it presents as if it is literally floating on top of all the other elements in your user interface. The goal of a floating action button is to trigger whatever the primary action is for the given screen that the user finds themselves. This action should be a constructive action. That is, an action that creates, new, write, add, things of that nature, versus delete, remove, close, and similar actions. You may find floating action buttons placed in various places within the user interface. Generally, again, it presents as if it's floating above the UI, but it can also be placed in a fashion that suggests it sits on top of elements or below elements on the regular XY plane. A menu in Android is a resource that is dynamically loaded and presents additional actions to the user that can be presented dynamically or embedded into other components such as the app bar. We're familiar with toasts, which are components that are used to provide feedback to the user in a non-obtrusive way. These are generally located at the bottom center of the screen and can be modified with custom layouts. The general idea behind a toast is that it is giving a message generally about an operation that has taken place, such as a status update. But what is important is that it should not be imperative that the user see this message. So it's status information that is useful if the user happens to be looking at the user interface. A snack bar is a UI component that is very similar to a toast, except the snack bar incorporates an action that the user can perform. This action is going to be related to the message that the user is seeing. For example, you might have a snack bar message that informs the user that a message has been sent. That snack bar could have a button or an action to recall or undo that send message, and essentially allowing the user to cancel that message for as long as the snack bar is present on the screen, which may just be a couple of seconds. Proper design suggests that you should only have a single action present on a snack bar. This is, of course, because the snack bar is only present on screen for a short amount of time, and if the user has to spend time reading and interpreting the various actions, the snack bar might disappear before they're able to take an action. A dialogue is a feedback mechanism that is used when we require the user to acknowledge the information that is being presented to them. This is the opposite use of snack bars and toasts, where we've determined that it's okay if the user has not seen or acknowledges the message. A dialogue is a windowed view that obscures a part of the activity behind it, and we can force the user to interact with that dialogue before they're able to make any progress in the application. Android provides some pre-built dialogues for performing some very common actions, such as picking a time or picking a date. And you can create your own dialogue by extending the dialogue class or using a builder. So let's look at some examples of these UI components in action. We'll start by adding a menu resource to our application's app bar. To do that, we'll first create a menu resource. So I'm going to hop over to my resource manager. I'm going to select menu, and then I'm going to click the plus button to add resources. From here, I select menu resource file. I'm now presented with a dialog where I can type the name of the resource. So in this case, I'll call my file main, and I will leave the directory name as menu. I could add qualifiers to essentially create alternates. However, without any qualifiers, I'll just have a default. And now I am presented with a UI to create my menu items. Under palette, I see that I have a few elements that I can add. And within my resource file, I already have a top level or a root level menu item. So from here, I'll just drag in a set of menu items. So I'll drag 3 menu items in. So let's say this application had the job of taking pictures among whatever other functionality it might have. Then what I might do is have menu items to trigger some of the core functionality of the application. So let's start with the first menu item, which we will use to trigger the camera action. So for my menu item, there are some properties or some attributes that I have to specify. The first is the ID. The common practice is to prefix all the IDs of the menu items that will be used in the app bar with the action prefix. Again, this is a recommendation, it's not a requirement. So I'll call this action take picture. The title is the text that will be displayed in the scenarios where text is required. It will also serve as the hint or information that is displayed if the user presses down on the menu item for an extended period. So for title, where I should be using a string resource, but in the interest of time, I'll simply type take picture. For icon, we specify what type of icon should be displayed if an icon is required. So in this case, I could add a set of images to my application as resources and reference them, or I can reference an icon from the SDK. In this case, I will reference the IC menu camera icon that comes pre-packaged with the SDK. Now, the last thing I'm going to change here is the attribute show as action. Show as action is a property that has a set of predetermined possible values. The first is always. This tells Android that this menu item should always show up as an action item. That is, a button will show up in the top of my activity. Android does not like when you specify always, so you should use this sparingly. Instead, Android would rather you specify if room. By selecting if room, you're telling Android that it should decide if the item should show up as an action item if there is enough space for it to show up. That is, if there is enough screen real estate or enough width to fit the button. Alternatively, you could tell Android that it should never be added as an action item and should instead be presented in the overflow menu, which is essentially the way it's looking or the way it's being presented to us right now. So for my take picture, which I consider to be a very important action, I will specify that it should be added if room. When I do that, I see that the item shows up as an action item, as a button. I see that I can see the icon and the text is not visible anymore. I'm going to do something similar for our second item. So perhaps this one is action, let's say delete picture. The title will be delete picture. And the icon, I'll select IC menu, delete. And I'll also specify that this should show up if room. So now I have two items. The last item, I'll call this one settings. So this is to show the settings for my application. For this one, I'm not even going to bother giving it an icon. And the reason I'm not going to give it an icon is that I want my settings to never show up as an action item. Because of that, it will only ever show up in the overflow. Now, it is possible that I may want to give my settings an icon if I plan to use this menu for other things, such as a pop-up menu. But in this scenario, where I only intend to use it as a menu for the app bar, and because settings will only ever show up in the overflow menu, which is going to be exposed whenever the user hits the three dots, then I don't even need to bother giving it an icon. There are additional attributes that you can set. For example, you can specify the order in which these elements should show up by simply specifying a necessary attribute. But by and large, these are the basics that we utilize. Now that we've specified the menu resource, we need to incorporate this into our activities app bar. To do that, we're going to override two functions. The first will be used to inflate or add the resource into our activity by converting it to an object. That function is called onCreateOptionsMenu. OnCreateOptionsMenu passes in a menu resource. Our job is to inflate our resource into this menu object. So to do that, I'm going to get the menu inflator that is a property of my activity. I don't need to create a menu inflator. And then I will simply inflate my resource, which is going to be r.menu.main into menu. Once I've done that, my menu resource will now show up in my application. So here we see that our application does not show our menu because our activity does not have an app bar. So in order to change that, we're going to have to modify our activities theme. And what we will do is here we see our app theme is based on theme material 3 day night no action bar, but we would in fact like an action bar, so we'll just change it to day night. And if all goes according to plan, we should now have an app bar, and here we see our menu. Here is the overflow that contains settings. So we have our menu items showing up. That's because we inflated it in our activities on create options menu function. In order to have actions be triggered by our selection, however, we need to override a second function. That function is on options item selected, where on options item selected will receive a menu item as an argument. That is the menu item that was clicked. From here then, we need only check to see which menu item was clicked and then make a determination of what action should be taken. So for example, we could specify that when item.item ID is equal to r.id.action take picture, then we would perform whatever the take picture action is. And we don't have such an action, so we'll just pop up a toast message. Let's see. Additionally, we can do the same thing for if you click settings. And we should be able to now see this behavior as toast messages showing up whenever we run our app and we click either the take picture button or select the settings option. Now, for our delete action, we might decide that this specific action is destructive. The purpose here would be to delete something that may not be recoverable. Because of that, we may not want to simply perform a delete action simply because the user presses the button. Instead, what we may want is for them to confirm that they did in fact want to delete the image. To have them provide that confirmation, we're going to use a dialog. To create that dialog, we're going to use the alert dialog builder. That builder allows us to use the builder pattern, where we simply provide context to the builder constructor. We can use the builder pattern to specify all of the properties that we would like our dialog to have, and then display that dialog afterwards. So we can start with, let's say, setting a title for our dialog. That title will be delete confirmation. After that, I would like to set the message. The message is, are you sure you would like to delete this image? Again, all of these should really be coming from a text resource. Now that I'm asking if they are confirming the action, if they actually want to do a delete, then I need to give them the option to say yes or to say no. So I'm going to add a positive button. The goal of a positive button is to essentially be the affirmative response to the question I'm asking, which in this case, the question is, do you want to delete this image? So the set positive takes two arguments. The first is the message. So in this case, the answer to my question is yes. And the second argument that the set positive function requires is an object for a particular interface. Now, the idea here is it's essentially a listener for the button, but it's not our standard on-click listener that we use for our regular views. But the good thing here is that I can actually just pass in a lambda. Now, this lambda is going to take two arguments. One will be the dialog interface and another will be an identifier. But if I plan to utilize these arguments, I can give them names. If I don't plan to utilize them, as I don't, Kotlin basically says you can then simply specify underscores as a way to denote that you are not interested in referencing the arguments that will be passed in. So in this case, set positive would just perform the delete action for me and then close the dialog. So in this case, I could do a toast. We need context. So I think I can just reference context here. And then I can close. Well, in order to close, I need to reference the dialog itself. So in this case, I think I actually do need access to the first argument, which will be my dialog. And I will simply cancel the dialog after performing. Well, technically I don't want to cancel. I technically want to dismiss. So I'm dismissing the dialog. Cancel makes it seem like we didn't perform the action, which, interestingly enough, is what we're going to do next with our set negative button. So here I give a response that is the negation of the question I'm asking. So are you sure you would like to delete this image? Never mind. Never mind again. I also need to provide a dialog interface. Same issue. So this is the dialog. And the second argument I don't care for. And in this case, I simply say dialog.cancel. Now that I have defined all of the items that I would like to have in my dialog, and there are a lot more things that I can do here. I can set icons, I can add adapters so that I can have multiple items listed. I can do multiple choice items. I can add neutral buttons. There's a lot, but this is a very basic dialog right now. So I can just specify that I would like to, I believe I just specify show. We'll try this and see if it works. So running my updated application, we see that I can take a picture. As always, I can bring up the settings, but when I hit delete, here I get my delete confirmation. Are you sure you would like to delete this image? Where I can hit never mind, or I can hit yes, and I get the deleting. Now, as I've done it here, it turns out the user could click outside of the dialog to dismiss it. If I don't want that behavior, I can also set the cancelability. I'm saying cancelability. I could call set cancelable and set that to false. This would basically prevent the user from clicking outside of the dialog, and instead they would have to acknowledge by clicking one of the buttons. So now if I click outside, nothing happens. I have to say yes or never mind. So this is just a small sampling of using some of the additional UI components that are available to us in an Android application. You can always continue to enhance and add to the feature set of your apps by exploring these UI components. Every new version of Android will bring new components that you can incorporate, and they help to keep your application modern and add to the overall user experience.